So in previous weeks, we noticed that Jacob was 130 years old when he brought the family down into Egypt. And today we want to look at where we're told Joseph's age several years before Jacob brought the family down into Egypt. So if you want to turn to Genesis chapter 41, Genesis chapter 41, and this is when Joseph was called before Pharaoh to interpret his dreams. And starting in verse 29, Genesis chapter 41, verse 29, Joseph told Pharaoh, "Indeed, 7 years of great plenty will come throughout all the land of Egypt. But after them, 7 years of famine will arise, and all the plenty will be forgotten in the land of Egypt, and the famine will deplete the land." Then if we skip down to verse 46, says, "Joseph was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh, king of Egypt." So now we know that Joseph is 30 years old at this point in time, and that there are going to be 7 years of plenty, followed by 7 years of famine. So now, if we turn to Genesis chapter 45, Genesis 45, we're at the time of the famine when Jacob sent his sons down into Egypt to get more grain the second time. And Joseph reveals himself to his brothers, and he tells them, starting in Genesis chapter 45, starting in verse 6, he says, "For these 2 years the famine has been in the land, and there are still 5 years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvesting. And God sent me before you to preserve a posterity for you in the earth, and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So now it was not you who sent me here, but God, and he has made me a father to Pharaoh, and lord of all his house, and a ruler throughout all the land of Egypt. Hurry and go up to my father and say to him, Thus says your son Joseph, God has made me lord of all Egypt. Come down to me, do not tarry." So now we can see that they were 2 years into this 7-year famine. And so, since we know that Joseph was 30 years old at the beginning of the 7 years of plenty, we know that now 9 years have passed and that he's now 39 years old. So Joseph is 39 years old at the point when Jacob brings the family down into Egypt. So now we also know Joseph's age as well as Jacob's age at that point. So now let's turn to Genesis chapter 50. Genesis 50. And starting in verse, just verse 22, says, Genesis 50:22, "So Joseph dwelt in Egypt, he and his father's household, and Joseph lived 110 years. And then down in verse 26, he says, "So Joseph died being 110 years old, and they embalmed him, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt." And now if we go over to the next page, in Exodus chapter 1, Exodus chapter 1, starting in verse 6 of Exodus chapter 1, says, "And Joseph died, and his brothers, and all that generation. But the children of Israel were fruitful and increased abundantly, multiplied and grew exceedingly mighty, and the land was filled with them. Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, Look, The people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply, and it happen in the event of war that they also join our enemies and fight against us, and so go up out of the land. Therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with their burdens. So now we can see that this affliction started after Joseph and his brothers in that generation had passed away. And so what we can do is we can look at the point where Jacob brought the family down into Egypt, and we know that Joseph was 39 years old at that point, and that he died at 110 years old. So 110 minus 31 or minus 39 is 71 years. So Joseph died 71 years after Jacob brought the family down into Egypt. And then we know that this affliction started sometime after. We're not told specifically, but we know it was after this 71 years had passed. So now, if we try to compare this to what we did earlier with the Exodus, when we had the 430-year span of the sojourn, we presume that that was when they entered Egypt. But now, if we look at that along with the 400-year span of the prophesied affliction, we can see that there are only 30 years between the beginning of the sojourn and the beginning of the affliction. And yet, there are at least 71 years between when we know that they entered Egypt and until Joseph died. So that's the conflict, and that's the problem. The good news is that there's a solution to it, and we'll look at that next week. So hope you join us next week.